Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today I'm sharing with you an audio recording of an interview I did with Jennie Deer. Jennie is the author of the book, What Does It Feel Like to Die?, which she based on interviews she did with doctors, nurses, psychologists, and other experts in the end of life. And we have a really interesting conversation about all the things that she learned while doing research for this book. So I hope you enjoy that. Be sure and subscribe to this channel down below, and subscribe and leave a rating and review for End of Life University podcast wherever you happen to listen. Also, if you're interested in offering a little support to help keep this show on the air, go to eoluniversity.com/support and find out how you could make a small monthly or annual contribution to keep us going. So now we'll move on with my conversation with Jennie Deer. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to End of Life University podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt. This is episode number 251, which I'm excited about because I've crossed another milestone, 250 episodes, which to be honest, when I first started this podcast, I had no idea I'd be able to keep it going for such a long time. So I feel proud of that. It's an accomplishment to be able to put out one episode a week and keep it going for almost 5 years now. So anyway, I'm celebrating that little milestone today. In a few moments, I'll be sharing with you an interview I did with journalist Jennie Deer about a book she wrote called What Does It Feel Like to Die? Inspiring New Insights into the Experience of Dying. And this interview was recorded actually a few months ago, right at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. And you'll hear us mention it during the recording a few times. And it was right before the lockdown started. And once we entered into that phase, I shifted over into doing interviews that were primarily about COVID-19 and the lockdown experience that we were all having. So I never got a chance to play this interview from Jennie. So I'm sharing it with you now so that you can benefit from the research she's done and some of the insights she has to share. So that's coming up in just a moment. Before that, I wanted to let you know about an event coming up. This is not my event, but I wanted to promote it because it sounds like something some of you at least would be interested in that I think would be really helpful. It's a course called Racism in Death Care, Confronting Bias, Ignorance, and Prejudice, taught by Joelle Anthony and Anita Grant. And it takes place on Friday, June 19th. So it's just a one-session course that you can sign up for. And it sounds excellent from everything I've read about it. And I truly believe it's so important that we keep having these conversations and share this information about our own area of expertise, end of life issues. We need to do some courses on racism in healthcare as well. But this focus on death care, I think, is important. I mentioned last week I've been reading a book called Passed On. And through that book, I've learned a lot about the racism that exists in healthcare and death care in this country. So this course, I think, sounds excellent, and it's going to address the issues that we really need to be looking at right now. There will be a link in the show notes for this episode to that course if you're interested in signing up. So it's Friday, June 19th, and you don't have to be present live. If you register and pay for the course, you'll be able to get the replay later on. So happy to promote that course for all of you. Next, I also want to thank my latest supporter on Patreon, Heather Capuano. Thank you, Heather, for signing up for our Patreon team to make a monthly donation toward the podcast. I really appreciate it. And if any of you are interested, you can just go to Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com/EOLU, and there you'll learn how to become a supporter and what kind of benefits you'll receive for signing up. Finally, I wanted to let you know every Friday since the coronavirus pandemic started, I've been sharing a story with you. The series has been called Love Over Fear, Stories for Precarious Times. And this coming Friday, the 19th, will be the 15th story in that series and the final story. If you've missed out on those, I just wanted to let you know you can go back and listen to them if you go to the show notes at eolupodcast.com. You'll be able to find all 15 of the stories there under Love Over Fear. So with that being said, we'll move on to today's interview with Jennie Deer. As always, stay tuned after the interview and I'll be back with a few takeaways and to say goodbye. Here we go. Today, I'm happy to welcome my guest, Jennie Deer. Jennie is a former journalist, an associate professor of English, and a longtime hospice volunteer. She is also the author of the book, What Does It Feel Like to Die? Inspiring New Insights into the Experience of Dying. And this book is one of the selections I made for the 2020 reading list for a year of reading dangerously. And ever since seeing the book, I've been excited to talk to Jennie about it. And if you want to learn more about Jennie and her work, you can go to her website at jenniedeer.com, and it's spelled JennieDear.com. So Jennie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Karen.
As I said, I've been interested in talking with you about the book. And one reason for that is because for me, I'm a physician and I worked in hospice most of my career. And so I realized that I sometimes have a very narrow view of things when I talk about and write about death and dying. It's the view of a hospice doctor. And I really enjoy hearing the perspective of people who are outside the field of medicine and outside this little world that I live in, and who are able to take a different perspective on death and dying, but also to do research and look at many different perspectives. So that's one thing one reason I'm really excited to talk to you about your book, Jennie. Well, I was hoping you'd start by telling us what inspired you to write a book about death and dying in the first place.
Sure. It's so interesting to me. In our culture, there's very few of us that grow up thinking, I really want to write about death and dying, or I really want to be involved in that field. And as I talk to other people who are hospice volunteers or read the stories of people who write about death and dying, for most of us, it's because we have some kind of personal experience. And for me, that was with my mom's dying experience. And it was 15 years ago that she died from advanced breast cancer. And then a year or two after that, I began volunteering with hospice. And those experiences made me so interested in finding out more. And I think for a lot of us who come face to face with death, if the experience is positive or has some positive parts, we really want to know more, and we really want to spend some time with that closeness to what feels like one of the most essential parts of life.
Yeah, so true. And I like what you're saying when the experience is positive. I think I also felt an urge to tell other people because I sensed how fearful other people were about death and dying and resistant to it. And it's feeling like, oh no, I know this secret now that so many other people don't know, that it can actually be a beautiful experience. And so I imagine it felt that way to you also.
It did. There was this sense, and I've seen this as a hospice volunteer too, and I'm sure you see it quite a bit, where when there's a peaceful death and there's a sense of harmony in the people around a dying person, there's something that's almost like sacredness. And you feel, for us, we felt this sense of sharp, deep reality of the close connections among family and the people who are there, and also about what's most important in life. But I also always try to remind people that there's no guarantees that your dying experience will be harmonious and have that beautiful silver lining that some of us get to experience. And I find that there are things people do and characteristics that people seem to have that make it more likely, but there's no guarantees. It's so easy to either romanticize the dying process or to be so afraid of it that you never think about it. And what I hope for people is that that in general, we take some kind of middle road and we say, oh, it's a deep, important experience. And it could mean all kinds of things. And I need to think about it ahead of time, but I don't know what it's going to be like when it comes to my own experience.
That's such a good point, and so true. And if we think about any major experiences of life, like childbirth, also, that's a different experience for each woman who goes through it. So we can't say it will always be like this, and each one of us has to get there being as prepared as we can be, but we still don't know what it will consist of or how it will unfold for us in the moment.
Right. And I think, I've been thinking about that with the coronavirus, that it's in large part the uncertainty that's so frightening about it, that there's this huge force that's shifting our society, and maybe it's just temporary, but there's big changes happening, and we don't know what it's going to be like tomorrow, much less next month. And death and dying is like that too, but we forget, and we have to forget to some extent, that we could die at any moment. And for me, the coronavirus is this helpful reminder of the even bigger thing that's going to happen to each of us as an individual, and that, I mean, our own death.
That's so true. And I'll mention that we're recording this, I would say, just as it feels like you and I both talked about how there's just really been a shift in the mentality of people in our communities toward taking the coronavirus very seriously. And so we're starting to, I think, enter into that phase where of exponential growth of cases of the virus, and people are it's the first time really when you look around and it seems as if everyone is taking some sort of steps or thinking about it or concerned about it, at least where I live, that's what's happening.
Yes, the same.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think it is this fascinating awakening of people who probably in their day-to-day lives don't think very much about their mortality, and they really are being confronted with it right now, moment to moment. And so it's very interesting to watch this shift happening, but not only around us in our own communities, around the entire world. I don't think we've ever experienced anything like this.
It's new, and I was telling my niece and nephew who are in their early 30s, late 20s. I said, we have never experienced anything like this in our lifetimes, and there have been plagues and big spreads of diseases in the past, but this is we have no personal experience with this.
Yeah, it's so true. And as you said already, it's the uncertainty that I think makes us feel a little unstable and feel like we can't just fall back into our habitual patterns. Everything feels somewhat new and different right now. And it also, I was writing in my journal today that it almost feels like a pregnant time, if I can use that word, but a time when something on the other side of this is going to be born, and possibly something new for all of us, but we just don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm. And I think, when I first had the inkling of this book, was for me sort of a similar kind of awakening when my mom, who knew for 6 years that she had cancer, and for 4 of those years knew that it was going to be terminal. She finally got to the end of her treatments and signed up for hospice. And the hospice nurse sat down with my mom and me and described some of the process and some of how hospice works. And then she turned to my mom and she said, "Do you want to know what the physical process of dying will be like?" And that question was such a relief for us, because all those years that my mom had known she had a terminal condition, no one had thought to talk to her about the physical process. And it was as if we were in this shared denial that her condition was probably going to result in her death. And it was such a relief to finally get information about what it might be like on a really literal level.
That's so interesting to me, because I feel like that is definitely something in this day and age where most of us don't witness the dying process in our own lives. We don't see it around us. Most people are completely unaware of what dying is like. And so, as you mentioned, it's so important that someone has the courage to say, "I can tell you about this if you want to know that." I think it could be very helpful to all of us, to everyone out there, to have a better idea, at least, of what happens and what to expect, or what might possibly happen for them.
And I think that was my feeling. And I think that's what I was so hungry for during my mom's process of going through the treatments and close to her end. And then afterwards, and working with hospice patients and seeing their different conditions, their different responses, and some of what was going on with them, and thinking we're so unprepared for this, and we often think it's our fault, right? But a lot of it is because of the wonderful advances in nutrition and hygiene and medicine in industrialized nations, so that we can expect these extended lifespans. We have low rates of infant mortality, and it means we don't have a routine organic relationship with death and dying. And I think some of that's really wonderful, that we don't have to witness as many deaths of people close to us early in life. But it can also mean that you get to be pretty advanced in your adulthood before you come face to face with it. And it's helpful to have facts and information.
Very true. And it does make me think maybe most people would like to know more, but don't even know how to ask, or who to ask, or if it's okay to ask about it.
Yes. And I've read that can happen a lot with doctors and nurses, that they're willing to discuss the subject. And for all I know, that was true of at least some of the doctors and nurses who dealt with my mother, that if she didn't bring it up, they didn't know to bring it up. And I think, at least in some places, medical personnel are now being better trained to do that, because we're so trained to respond to how our doctors acting or what they're talking about. So it's difficult for a patient to do, but it's also difficult for a doctor, because if your patient is stuck in denial, you don't necessarily want to be the one who pulls them out of it, right? Because it's not an easy thing to do.
Yes, so true. And on the doctor's part, not knowing how the patient will react, and if it could have, a negative effect for the patient if you bring it up at the wrong time or in the wrong way. I think that's something doctors may worry about as well.
And for me, one of the experiences that really stayed with me with hospice patients, and then also from the research that I did, was the deep levels of denial for some hospice patients. So I would talk to patients who were not only in hospice, but that were in some kind of residential hospice. So they were living in a place where they had to sign papers that said they knew a doctor felt that they had 6 months or less to live. And they would tell me that they thought they had something like a bad cold. And to have that level of denial, that late in their disease, was pretty shocking to me. And as I read more about the kind of denial that people go through, I've seen that, often our first response in our culture to denial is to say, oh, it's always bad. And of course that's not true. Of course, it can be a really helpful mechanism in allowing us to take in small bites something that would be overwhelming if we consumed it whole, right? The information that we've got something that's about to end our lives is so difficult. And that's been studied. And there's this lovely, or I thought just very apt term that a nurse researcher, Nessa Coyle, came up with called the existential slap for what many patients go through when they first learn they have a terminal condition. And it's when they move from that intellectual knowledge that we all have, that we're going to die someday, to a realization on a gut level that includes me. And it just pulls the ground out from under people in a lot of cases and can send them into this tailspin of depression and all kinds of extreme emotions. But it doesn't last. The researchers who have studied it say that you come out of that. And for some patients who really are able to face what's going on and come out of denial, they can come out with a stronger appreciation for life and for human connection and an ability to appreciate the time they have left.
And I was just thinking about how that correlates with what our own society here in the US has been going through regarding coronavirus, because I think, for a couple of months, we've been looking at these reports coming from China and in complete denial about the fact that this virus could and would spread to our own country. And so in some ways, we've kept ourselves distant from that information until it's gotten closer and closer and closer. And we're at the point where we can't deny anymore that it's here right now and we have to face it. And it just made me wonder if maybe some of the behaviors that we're hearing about, the maladaptive behaviors of people hoarding food and toilet paper, maybe it's a kind of a coping mechanism of following that existential slap of, there's a major threat here, right here on our own doorsteps. And that just occurred to me that maybe that's something similar. We're in a bit of a tailspin right now, but we are going to come out of it, and people are going to be able to deal with this in a more rational manner and move forward and cope in a positive way, hopefully.
Hopefully. Yeah. I think that's a nice parallel because if we know that there's the possibility of more positive feelings and reactions, then we're more likely to go in that direction. And that's really powerful knowledge in helping us to cope better, either with a pandemic or with our own mortality or that of the people who are close to us.
Mm. Yes, that's such a good point. And that's a hopeful point, I think, for us to talk about right now too, at this point where we are in our world. Well, you mentioned denial, and that's one of the chapters in your book, writing about the denial of death in our society. But you also cover really a broad range of topics: hospice care, medically assisted dying. I can't even list all of them. Many different topics, and even consciousness at the end of life. And I was curious about how you decided which topics to include in the book.
That's such a good question, and I think in some ways it was almost random, and in other ways it was quite the opposite, because it seemed to me that these were the questions that I wrestled with in my mother's dying process, but also many of the questions that the patients and families that I worked with wrestled with. And I also was pretty conscious of the both the importance of spirituality and the fact that the information I was hungriest for was the really literal physical information, because I felt like I could go out and I could read about death and dying, and people would become very vague about it, or they would talk about the positive sides of it. And I want to know that, but I also want to know what are some of the difficult things, and what do we know about the physical process, because that helps me prepare. And my background was, I started my career as a small town journalist, and then I became an English professor. And so I had spent my life doing research, and I found knowledge comforting, right? It makes me feel more prepared. And I don't want to spend our time on the coronavirus, but it makes me feel better about the coronavirus too, when I can find out more information about what we know about how the disease processes, and what we know about what we can control about it. And then leave the rest to fate, right? To allow for the parts that we can't control. And I think that's a really important part of knowing about the dying process. Again, that there are a lot of things we can do to prepare ourselves. And that's by knowing what we need to know about the physical process, about some of the mental issues that people go through, about preparing people for when you're no longer around. And then there's also so much that we can't know about those final hours or days. And we have to let go of that. And sometimes just the letting go is what people need to do.
Mm-hmm. That's so true. And it occurs to me that it takes a certain amount of, curiosity on the one hand, wanting to know more things, but also courage to do the kind of research that you did for this book, because again, you were headed into the unknown, not knowing for sure what you would learn and what you would hear from people. And it's just having that courage to say, it's okay. It's okay to learn whatever I learn, to hear whatever I hear, and find out things I didn't know before, even if they're disturbing. It's okay to do that. In fact, I'll be better off if I do find out this information.
Mm-hmm. I like that idea that I was courageous, but it didn't feel especially courageous as I did the research. And I think one of the reasons that was true was, as I talked to different experts and researchers, that they were so passionate about their work and so passionate about their patients that they felt they discovered this secret. And I think that's what you called it earlier in our conversation, that there's this lovely thing that we can encounter around death and dying. And I think no matter what I learned, I kept coming to that people would say, yes, it can be painful. Yes, it's certainly uncomfortable. Yes, people suffer, and we never want to ignore that, and we never want to ask a dying patient to be a certain way, to follow some expected route to death. But there's also this chance for, not, I wouldn't say enlightenment, I would say just this chance for closeness and greater meaning.
Yes, so true. And I was wondering if you'd share with us a little bit about the research process that you went through for the book. Who did you interview? How did you find them? What led you to certain people to interview for the book? Because you certainly have a big variety of people that you talk to.
I do. And it was, again, it would be saying, I really need to know about pain, for instance. And I came to pain through my mother's experience. I still remember we were driving back from Denver, where she'd gone for some kind of treatment or process. And that's a 6 or 7 hour drive from Denver to where I live in Durango. And we touched on that topic of what does it feel like to be the daughter of someone who has a terminal condition? And what does it feel like to be the mother? What does it feel like to be the person who has a terminal condition? And she said, I really am not afraid of dying. And maybe that'll change when I get to the moment, but I don't think it will. But I am afraid of the possibility of physical pain. And it turns out that's true for a lot of dying patients, that they're much more afraid of the potential for physical pain and suffering than they are of death and dying itself. And when I talked to different experts in the field, I started asking them about that. Does death have to be physically painful? And the answer that I got over and over again was no, with some caveats, that for the most part, somewhere between 92% and 97% of dying patients don't have to have, well, let's say their physical pain can be brought under control. But one of the problems is that it can be, but it is not in a lot of cases. And that's for a whole host of reasons, one of which being that our society is so afraid of opioids, for good reason in other cases, but not so much for people who are dying. And that can be both doctors and patients who say, no, I don't want to get addicted. I don't want to overprescribe to this person. But it means that in many cases, there are dying patients who don't get pain treated in ways that are where it's really quite possible that they could be. And then another part of the physical dying process that I think it's too easy to forget about is the physical discomfort that happens when people aren't necessarily in what we would call pain, but maybe they have constipation or nausea or coughing or breathing issues, and that those can also be controlled, but they often happen in association with the dying process. And then a third part of suffering that some of these researchers talked to me about was the mental suffering, the emotional suffering that's connected with dying. And Ira Bayek, who's a wonderful doctor who's written a lot about the dying process and has worked with a lot of dying patients, said, no matter what, there will be suffering because you're losing everything and everyone you've ever loved. And so even if there's no physical suffering, or even if that's well under control, there's still suffering involved in the dying process.
Mm-hmm.
So he's a good example. I read a couple of his books about the I think it's called the 4 questions, and he talks about the questions that somebody who knows they're dying should talk about with their family and the people that they're close to, that they should make sure that they address, that they say thank you, and that they say they're sorry, and that they ask for forgiveness, and say that they love these people. And he's so well known that I thought, he's not going to talk to me. And so I found his email address and wrote him, and he said, sure. When do you want to talk? And I found that over and over again. So I think one of my early initial fears was that if I called people out of the blue, they weren't going to want to spend their time talking to me. They were going to want to spend their time talking to the dying patients that they had so little time with. So that was an interesting part of doing my research. Another part was one of the questions that I wondered about, that I found so many family members also wondered about, was it's very frequent for a dying patient to enter a time in their last days, or maybe even weeks, when they're either semi-conscious or unconscious. And they sort of drift in and out of consciousness, and they turn away from the people that they've loved and they've focused on for all the rest of their lives. And if you're the family member witnessing that, it's not necessarily hurtful, but it's different. It feels so uncharacteristic. And especially, if you're a daughter or a son and you're witnessing it in a parent, because so many parents treat their kids with that kind of focused attention. So my mother did that, and my question was, well, where is she? What's going on with her consciousness now? And I started researching that, and the short answer is that no one really knows what's going on with the consciousness. But I got very excited about some of the very recent work that neuroscientists have been doing with patients who are in a minimally conscious state. And they've done some experiments with people who were thought to be sort of in a vegetative state, and found out that they were able to respond. And they studied them under an MRI, and they saw that when they assigned these people mental tasks, they were able to respond to those tasks. When they were asked to play tennis, basically mentally, that their brains were showing evidence that they were mentally playing tennis. And I said, well, is it possible that that's where dying people are? And the people doing this work said it is totally incorrect science to take that and apply that narrow experiment and try to apply it to a more general situation. And besides that, people who are dying, we know their brains are shutting down, and that's not necessarily what's going on with these people's brains. But I did talk with one expert neurologist who said, the one caution that I would extend to anyone is that we tend to err in the direction of thinking we know more than we do. And he said he teaches all of his med students to just assume that the person that they're working with is much more aware than they think. And he said, I wouldn't be surprised at all if dying patients are more aware than they seem. And anyone who's worked around dying people has heard that saying, that hearing is the last sense to go.
Mhm.
And, and I asked him about that. I said, how do we know that? And he said, well, you don't, but you know that people aren't seeing, right? Because usually their eyes are closed, and smell and taste are sort of shutting down because they're no longer eating when they're close to death. But hearing, he said, there are two main parts of it. There's what the physical ear organ is doing, and then there's the brain's processing of the sounds coming in. And so while somebody's ears may be working, the brain may no longer be processing. But again, he said, we don't know at what moment that stops happening. So why wouldn't you assume that someone is still able to hear?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, I really was fascinated by that part of the book, and you're writing about the research that had been done. And I think that's a very wise position to take, that really there's so much more that we don't know or understand. It's really a mystery, and we should be humble enough to honor the mystery of dying, but as you said, not to take anything for granted. And why not assume that our loved ones, at the very least, whether they can hear us literally saying, I love you, at the very least, they can probably feel and perceive that someone's there showering them with this loving energy.
Right. And you also find, and again, this is one of the pieces of knowledge that hospice workers all know about. And that's that you don't know how much someone who's dying wants or needs other people around. Because of course there are people where that's really helpful and comforting, and parts of the process when they want somebody there. But there also does seem to be a time for a lot of dying people when it's distracting, or they are still trying to protect the people that are close to them from witnessing their suffering. And all kinds of stories, and I've seen this too, where someone who's dying and is surrounded by relatives seems to choose the moment that the relatives are out of the room to actually die. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some truth to that. But I've also always been concerned about laying too heavily a responsibility on loved ones for the timing of someone's death. So it seems to me fine to tell somebody it's okay to go, and of course we'll miss you, but we accept that you're dying and it's okay to let go and die. But I also think you don't want someone to ever take on a sense of blame or responsibility that someone lingered and suffered because of it.
Exactly, because I think what we can assume is that each patient has their own path, their own trajectory, and their own timing, and we loved ones or family members may or may not play into that. Whether we're there or not there, it's not really up to us, and that we have to allow whatever to happen and not take too much responsibility in either direction for it.
Right.
Well, one thing that I have really wanted to talk about, because I've actually wanted to do a whole podcast episode on this idea, the 4 trajectories of dying, because I feel like this is also something that people don't think about very often, about the dying process and what it actually looks like when we study it and when we observe the different ways in which people die. And you wrote about that very cogently in your book. And so I thought that's something I'd love to discuss with you, if you wouldn't mind going through the 4 trajectories of dying that you covered in the book.
Yeah, there's sort of 2 that I think we're really familiar with, and that's a graph that shows a horizontal line that's represents a life of general good health, goes along, and then there's a vertical line that it runs into that represents sudden death. So you fall off a cliff and life is over. And a lot of people say, that's the death I want, because I won't have to suffer, right? I'll just be here, and then suddenly I won't, until they learn more about it. Because I think the process that my mother went through, which is the second trajectory, allows people more time to say goodbye, to come to an acceptance, to have those wonderful last times together and memories. And that's a death where, again, you have a horizontal life of general good health. And then there's this sort of incline, this gradual incline line that it meets with. So that's really typical of certain kinds of cancer, where people like my mother are able to continue to travel, to do social events, and then in their very last few months, their activities become very limited, and they sort of settle down to die. And my mother went to Australia with my dad a month before she died, and she probably shouldn't have, but she was up and active and doing things, and then finished her last treatment and died within a few weeks. And that's not that unusual for certain kinds of cancer. But what we get caught up in is the sense that those are the two ways of dying, when in fact it's more frequent now for people in this country to do something more like the other two graphs. And one of them is a line that just sort of bounces and waves from the top left-hand side down to the bottom of the graph. And the other one sort of starts at the bottom with poor health from the beginning and goes in waves until you finally hit your final event. And that's when people have usually several serious chronic conditions, and especially as they become elderly and more vulnerable, they may bounce in and out of the hospital, each time recovering, maybe not quite to the point where they were before, until they're so weak and their immune system so compromised that all it takes is something like a minor cold for them to die. And they don't tend to have the chance to realize that they're dying, even though a doctor can look at them, months or years ahead of time and say, this person is probably going to die of this group of conditions. And what's helpful to me about those graphs is, if you know about them, then you can look at someone who has serious chronic conditions, and again, especially someone who's elderly, and say, so I know that their time is pretty limited. And I know we should have these discussions about how invasive or aggressive a medical procedure do they want if something happens. And they get to make choices, and they get to have those chances to say goodbye. And so I think the knowledge can allow us preparation and choice in a way that not understanding the different routes to death doesn't allow us. Mm-hmm. The people who studied these graphs, people like Joanne Lynn, who's a health policy expert, have said they can also allow us to set up better as a society, because we can do hospice for a person who just has a few months where they need external care besides the family to do really intensive daily care for someone. But we're not really set up for somebody who's going to take years where they're very dependent for daily activities because of their illness. And if we look at these more scientifically, we can set up for different routes to death.
It's so true. And I think it's that trajectory of chronic illness or multiple chronic illnesses that is, it's a slow downward progression, as you said, like spiked with multiple hospitalizations where things take a downturn, then get better, but never get back to the level they were before. So there's a continual decline going on. That oftentimes I'm not sure even that healthcare providers recognize in the midst of that graph of that, recognize what's happening, and they may miss the opportunity to explain it to family members, even to say, you know what, your mother's been in the emergency room 3 times in the last year, and each time she's gotten weaker, so she's on this curve, like even to make family members aware of what's happening. This is the trajectory that your mother's following, and you need to know that because there will be more hospitalizations, there will be further decline, and now might be a perfect time to have that conversation and really talk to her about what she wants. And I think too often we miss those opportunities because we haven't thought about it.
Yes, I agree. And I think I'm a baby boomer, and I, like many of my friends, have an elderly parent still alive. And I talk to those friends, and they're all dealing with some of the different implications of knowing someone and caring for someone who's very old and has some kind of serious health condition. And when they have a way to talk about dying with that person, they're able to find out more about what that person would want. And when I say that, I mean how much aggressive medical intervention they would want if some kind of emergency happened. And I think just that single issue can make such a difference in somebody's life, in whether they spend years in a nursing home or dependent on someone, and that's their preference in some cases, or whether they say, you know, if I get pneumonia, please leave me alone and let me die a quiet old person's death. And it's become a choice because we have so many artificial interventions that keep people living in ways, in times when sometimes they very much don't want to be.
Mm-hmm. So true. And so as difficult as it is, I think it's so important for us to have these conversations. And I really feel like using these graphs, it can be a helpful way for people to wrap their head around what we're talking about here, and to wrap their head around what has been happening and then what will continue to happen and what may be coming in the future. And so to me, it seems a useful way to look at it and to get people to recognize where they are on the trajectory.
Mm-hmm. And I think you can, the first people to really discuss the graphs were Avery Weissman, and I forget his first name, Warden, discussed it in their book about experiencing dying. But people since then, a lot of experts have built on the idea and come up with different variations of the graph. So you could do a simple search online and take a look at just those ideas, or use those to show people, here's what we're talking about. And I think even for me, it helped me, because I think watching someone so important to me die in a certain way led me to think, oh, then that's the way I'll die, right? Which is so naive, because it could well be, but I could also end up with the chronic conditions and bouncing in and out of the hospital. And at that point, I want to have talked to my husband and my relatives about what's most important to me.
Mm-hmm. So true. So true. Well, one other topic that I really wanted to cover, because you did a lot of great research here, was medical aid in dying. And so you have a great chapter, which I think could be very helpful to people interested in that topic. And so I wanted to, I know we're getting a little bit short on time, but I just wanted to talk somewhat about what you found out in your research about why people seek out medical aid in dying in our society, or for what reasons are people likely to seek it out. And we already talked about pain, and that was something interesting that I thought we could cover again as we look at this topic.
Mm-hmm. I think it's often a fear of physical pain. It's usually not because of physical pain. Again, because that's so treatable, that somebody says, I have a terminal condition, which is the only way that it's legal in our country, and I have a doctor has signed, 2 doctors have signed off on that, and I just am ready to end this process early. And sometimes it's concerns about being a burden on the people that they love. Sometimes it's just not wanting to prolong that process. And again, I think by virtue of medical technology, we've already prolonged the process of dying. That we've got pacemakers, we've got ventilators, we've got all kinds of medications that mean someone who has a really serious medical condition lives longer than, of course, they would have naturally. And there's a lot of good to that. But if at some point someone says, I don't want to drag this out, that we have to respect that as well. And I interviewed felt like a whole lot of people who have tried to either make the drugs available to people who have worked to, who are willing to write prescriptions for dying people, because that's difficult to find in a lot of cases, because it's still so controversial no matter what state you're in. And they were such caring people and so aware of treating their patients with respect. And I think every single one of them had seen some of the suffering of dying patients, and that was what led them to support medical aid in dying. And so they do what they can to help. And when they're there, because the doctors are not usually present, it's usually a volunteer may come, or in some cases, in some states, a hospice nurse may be present, although hospice has been really careful to separate themselves from medical aid in dying for all kinds of political reasons that in many cases I support, because people think of hospices already as ending people's lives, and that's not what they're there to do. They're there to support them. But anyway, so the people who have witnessed the deaths of people who take advantage of medical aid in dying say it is so peaceful and so much what you would wish for someone who's important to you, that they would hope that we would continue to make that available for the people that want it. And it continues to be a really small percentage of people in general, and even people with terminal conditions.
Mm-hmm. And I do know that it can be a frustrating process for people trying to utilize in states where it is legal, trying to utilize the law, patients who are totally qualified, but it can be a challenging process to get the doctor to write a prescription and even to obtain the prescription.
Oh, it's crazy. And for instance, one issue is timing. And if a patient says, this is the process I want, and they start to get the doctor's okay for it, and then their condition worsens, and perhaps they're no longer, in some cases, able physically to take the medicine because their throats close up, or in some cases their brains begin to shut down, and so they're no longer able to end their suffering earlier, even though they've made it clear that that's their wishes. And then I've heard stories from doctors trying to get a pharmacist who's willing to prescribe, or willing to fill a prescription and getting medicine to patients that are just, it seems so wrong, does such an injustice to the dying patient.
Yeah, we have a long way to go. But I really appreciate that you included a chapter on this in your book, because it's so good to educate everyone about it. The people in our society who might be skeptical or fearful of it, and other people who are embracing it. I think the more education we have for everyone, the better it can be down the road as we work our way through it.
And I think there are legitimate, very important questions about it. And I like it that our society is hesitant in many ways to embrace this, because there are dangers, and because we do want to make sure that we're providing really good treatment and support for dying patients, right? That we're not just going, oh, well, you can end your suffering with this drug instead of saying, well, we could provide you with better treatment for your pain and depression, and then you might have a few last weeks or months that are enriching and rewarding in some important ways. But I also think there is terrible suffering sometimes, and that if someone chooses to end that early, that it's important to respect that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. And I think we have to view that as, I guess, what do I want to say, a fine line that we need to walk. But it's so important that we be able to go down that fine line, and that we be able to look at each case, each patient, and with compassion, and help them figure out what might be the best choice down the road. Jennie, but as a last question, I'm just curious for you personally, did writing the book change your own relationship to death and dying in any way? And if so, how?
I'm sure that it has in ways that I don't even know, because I think by thinking about it and telling ourselves we are all going to die, and we know that helps us begin to prepare for that time. But I also feel that I have so much more to learn and so much more work to do in really accepting that I'm going to die. And I know that people who are far more advanced than I have said that then when they have some kind of life-threatening accident or experience, that they realize that when you enter that process, there's so much mystery and so much new, and it's one of the great challenges of life, and I think any preparation is helpful, and that's what I feel like I've done. I feel like I've done some preparation for myself in understanding a little bit more, and that I'll keep doing that until the end of my life.
And your book, I will say, is an excellent foundation for people who want a better understanding and want to start the process of educating themselves as well. So I highly recommend it to people to read as a resource. And I'll say the title again: What Does It Feel Like to Die? Inspiring New Insights into the Experience of Dying, by Jennie Dear, Dear. And so, Jennie, where can people get a copy of the book?
Probably one of the easiest ways is through Amazon. And I also have a couple of buttons on my website, jenniedeer.com. And one of those is to our local bookstore in Durango, Maria's Bookshop, which you can order through them online. And they're one of those wonderful independent bookstores.
Oh, nice. Which I know all of us really want to help support and keep our independent bookstores, however many we have left. We want to help support them. And then I know that you have a YouTube video. So if you would mention that to us briefly too.
Yes, there's a video that my husband, Tom Bartels, and I just recently did. It's 3 minutes long, and it's about the physical process of dying, and it takes a really accessible approach. We used this doll that has little organs that come out of its torso, and there's an animation filter. So it's a really helpful teaching tool, actually, for some hospice groups, and it's just a gentle guide through the process. It's also called "What Does It Feel Like to Die?" And I think if you Google "What Does It Feel Like to Die?" YouTube Jennie Deer, it should come right up.
All right. And I will put a link to it in the show notes for this episode, which are at eolupodcast.com, and also a link to Jennie's website and book. And so, Jennie, I just want to thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much, Karen.
And keep writing, keep researching and writing, because you're helping a lot of people with what you're putting out into the world.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Jennie Deer. As I mentioned, I'm always happy to talk to people who work outside the end-of-life arena, but who are interested in it and doing research and learning about it and then sharing their insights, because sometimes those of us who are in the middle of the field can get a little limited or blinded in our own thinking, kind of handicapped in some ways by our own expertise. So it's always nice to get input from another person who has maybe a more objective perspective. And one of the things that I was really excited to share about were the trajectories of dying. And Jennie mentioned 4 of them. And Jennifer Moore Ballantyne, who is an expert in palliative care, has added a 5th trajectory, which I'll mention to you. But the 4 trajectories that I talked about with Jennie, just to reiterate, are sudden death, terminal illness such as cancer, number 3, chronic illness, and number 4, frailty. Jennifer Moore Ballantyne has added a catastrophic event such as a stroke, a hip fracture, or traumatic brain injury, which might occur in an elderly person who's on a trajectory of slow decline, but then suffers a sudden catastrophic event that leads more precipitously toward death. The reason these trajectories are helpful is because, as we talked about, each one of them contains a graph, and I'm going to link to a PDF by Jennifer Moore Ballantyne that you can read, and you can see the graphs, because it's really helpful as a visual aid to look at the graphs of this process in a way as we move toward death through life. And it's very helpful if you're working with someone and trying to help them complete an advance directive, to help them understand how the end of life might come about for them. And for most people, for most of us, it's going to be a slow decline from chronic illness and ending up perhaps in frailty, and then perhaps a catastrophic event after that. And so as people are planning ahead for their advance directives, it's really helpful to be able to imagine these scenarios and to think about what we need to plan for and how we need to be prepared for what might come at the end of life. So again, I will link to Jennifer Moore Ballantyne's PDF that has more in-depth descriptions of these trajectories of dying, and it includes all 5, including the catastrophic event. and also the graphs that you can look at visually. So there's something that you could even copy them. I mean, just draw them into a notebook or on a piece of paper and use them in your own teaching, or if you want to talk to a loved one who's filling out advanced directives, or even if you're doing your own. So come to the show notes at eolupodcast.com and you'll find that link. Also a link to Dr. Joanne Lynn talking about 3 of the trajectories in a YouTube video, and then a link to Jennie Deer's video that we mentioned during the interview. So one final thing before I go, just remember that my book, 7 Lessons for Living from the Dying, is available right now, and you can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Google Books, and you can also order it through any bookstore if you happen to have a bookstore that's opening up in your area. So I hope you'll take a look at that. I'm getting tons of positive feedback and good reviews about it, and I've been able to do some really fun interviews that will be coming out in the future about the book. So I'm excited about it. And so that's about it. All I need to share with you for today. So be sure to tune in every Monday for a new episode. And until next week, remember, we're here for love. So face your fear, be ready for whatever might happen next, and love your life. Love each and every moment of it. Bye-bye.